Science Fiction University.
Hello and welcome to Science Fiction University.
We're your fan and writer hosts. I'm Blue Gal.
And I'm Driftglass. And you can contribute to Science Fiction University by visiting our website at sciencefictionuniversity.com. There is a Patreon button at our website, or you can mail us a letter and or contribution to Science Fiction University, P.O. Box 9133, Springfield, Illinois, 62791. Now, this podcast, as always, comes with a warning. This episode contains spoilers for short stories by Jack Williamson, Ursula Le Guin, Frederick Pohl, as well as a little bit of a Robert Heinlein novel entitled The Door into Summer, as well as Pixar's 2008 movie Wall-E. We're also going to be talking about Dune and its sequels, and Tim Apple's production of something that is loosely related to Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy.
Emphasis on the loosely.
Very loosely.
Today's show comes in two parts. First, we're going to look at a little discussed niche in science fiction, which is sometimes the theme of the story and sometimes just mentioned in passing: the problem of abundance. Second, we're going to do what science fiction writers do and take something happening in the real world today and talk about what if. Today's what if question is, what if we, Driftglass and Blue Gal, were advising Denis Villeneuve on whether or not to tackle some or all of the rest of the Dune books? We'll also take on the question of why this particular, nearly 60-year-old novel works so well, why it still has so many fans, and why so many people cared so much and were so anxious about the attempt to bring it once again to the big screen.
Cool. I'm looking forward to that part. But first, let's you and I talk about abundance, which is a tricky topic for science fiction to address because the opposite of abundance, which is scarcity, is so much easier to use as a setting for dramatic conflict. So if you look at anything from 1984 to A Boy and His Dog, to The Parable of the Sower, to A Canticle for Leibowitz, think of how many works of science fiction are all set in a grim future where civilization has collapsed due to war or disease or climate change or whatever. A future where much of humanity has been wiped out and existence is a daily struggle to find food and water and safety. In fact, if you think about it, this is how 2001: A Space Odyssey begins, with two tribes of primates, our ancestors, fighting over a watering hole and hiding in caves from the superior predators all around them. Scarcity is an easy tool to develop as a theme of conflict. Just think about Dr. Strangelove. Mr. President, we must not allow a mine shaft gap. I love that line. Collectively, there are probably, tens of thousands of such short stories and novels and novellas and comic books and movies and records and God knows what all else, radio plays, which makes a certain kind of sense because in these settings, finding a dramatic conflict is relatively easy. In fact, it's literally around every corner. And creating and resolving dramatic conflict is the essence of literature.
Now, this brings us to one of the earliest concepts in tragic literature, catharsis, which was introduced by the Greeks and became the most critical element of Greek tragedy. At the end of each play, the protagonist experiences a catharsis, a realization that the tragedy of his life was brought about by his own actions, and that he must improve from that moment on. As a result, his soul is cleansed, and he is whole again. The character's catharsis becomes the audience's catharsis. They feel the same intense emotions as the character and leave the theater feeling purged and cleansed when the play is over.
Mm-hmm.
From this comes the concept of the tragic hero, which at the time of the Greeks meant a person of noble birth, honorable and brave, loyal to both the state and to their family, who conducted themselves under a strict code of values. But to be a tragic hero, the hero has to have a tragic flaw, one that is absolutely rooted in their code of values and that destroys them in the end. It is from that struggle between values and outcome, taking his values too far, that the audience learns a lesson, which is why no matter how much backstory you pile up on him, Superman is not and cannot be a tragic hero. But Batman is a tragic hero. Both Superman and Batman are of noble birth and they do heroic things in defense of their community. But Superman's flaw is a mineral, kryptonite. Batman's flaw is his own fanaticism against crime.
Yep.
And you can see that code of values in tragedies from the Iliad, which was written down sometime in the 7th or 8th century BCE, to Omar in the HBO series The Wire.
So you're my eyeball witness, huh? So why'd you step up on this?
Bird trifling, basically. Killing everyday working man and all. I mean, don't get it twisted. I do some dirt too, but I ain't never put my gun on nobody who wasn't in the game.
A man must have a code.
Oh, no doubt.
It's easy to put a hero into a nuclear wasteland or zombie apocalypse, a drug-plagued street of Baltimore, the crime-ridden Gotham City, and the audience roots for the tragic hero. And he fails because he can't fight the evils of this world without absorbing them. Now, this is all fiction writing 101.
Yeah. Yep.
You know this is a basic plot device, has basic character development, put some hero in an evil setting, and it's his passion for ending the evil that gets him in the end. We all have heard that story. Okay.
And you and I have conducted writing classes where it's like the most basic thing you do is you have a character who wants something and you put obstacles in their way. That's the story. That's the whole story. And presumably their obsession with getting to the end is what drives them and makes them a good protagonist. But their fanaticism or excess or willing to break the rules to get where they want to go is their flaw. That's basic storytelling. But what happens when the society in which you set your story is not a nuclear wasteland or a zombie apocalypse or the drug-riddled streets of Baltimore? What if, in fact, it's pretty nice? For example, Star Trek.
He's one of the thousands of species that we've encountered. We live in a peaceful federation with most of them. The people you see are here by choice.
So there are privileged few who serve on these ships, living in luxury and wanting for nothing. But what about everybody else? What about the poor? You ignore them.
Poverty was eliminated on Earth a long time ago, and a lot of other things disappeared with it. Hopelessness, despair, cruelty.
Young lady, I come from a time when men achieved power and wealth by standing on the backs of the poor, where prejudice and intolerance are commonplace and power is an end unto itself. And you're telling me that isn't how it is anymore?
That's right.
Maybe. It's worth giving up cigars for, after all.
By setting his fiction in a future where poverty and bigotry are no longer issues and greed has been tamed, Gene Roddenberry and his writers present themselves with some unique challenges. Star Trek was about flying into the unknown and trying to resolve conflicts, usually peacefully. Every character you'll note in the original series was flawed, could be defined as a tragic hero at some point, but as a team, as a group, they balance each other out. So Spock's logic balances out Kirk's excessive enthusiasm and vice versa, things like that. Now, this is all well and good, but other authors look into the future to find peace and plenty and see problems. It's something the movie The Matrix touches on, albeit briefly.
Did you know that the first Matrix was designed to be a perfect human world, where none suffered, where everyone would be happy? It was a disaster. No one would accept the program. Entire crops were lost. Some believed that we lacked the programming language to describe your perfect world, but I believe that as a species, human beings define their reality through misery and suffering. So the perfect world was a dream that your primitive cerebrum kept trying to wake up from. Which is why the Matrix was redesigned to this, the peak of your civilization.
This is a really great insight. We, as a species, as a people, instinctively reject the dream of peace and prosperity because although that is what we want, that's what we strive for, that's what we dream about, our whole history tells us we will never achieve it. Our utopias all fall apart. Except our failed utopias, especially in science fiction, are all set during the industrial or post-industrial age. There were societies that had much more harmonious relationships with the earth and with their neighbors who were other tribes before Europeans arrived on this continent, but expanding Western civilization rolled over them with the railroad, industrial-scale mining, and capitalism.
In case you've never read The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, but only seen the movie, his future of aggressive underground machine-using Morlocks and the passive surface-dwelling Eloi, which the Morlocks harvest for food, was not created by a nuclear war. In 1895, when the novel was published, there was no such thing. Wells' novel predicts a future in which the increasing inequality and class division of Wells' own time eventually gives rise to two separate human species. And Wells was a socialist, so we get that. This is a class war that creates the two human species that are at odds with one another. And one is exploiting the other. I mean, you can clearly see that.
Mm-hmm.
In the stories we're talking about today, the stories about problems of peace and plenty, there are still protagonists because there are no stories without protagonists. But in these stories, our protagonists are in conflict with the political and economic systems that created that peace and prosperity, which usually comes at a cost.
Yeah, exactly. And our first example is actually a subplot in Robert Heinlein's novel, The Door into Summer, which was serialized in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1956 and published in hardcover. It's not a hardcore novel, but it was in hardcover in 1957. It was also made into what I understand is a pretty good movie in the year 2020 by director Takahiro Miki. It's about an inventor of robotic technology who is robbed by his girlfriend and his business partner and sent into the future via cryogenic sleep. Now, sleepers in this novel are resented by the rest of society because they're seen as cowards who ducked out on the very hard work of cleaning up the wreckage of the 20th century. So when our protagonist awakes 30 years later, broke and with no usable skills, he kind of becomes a ward of the state and is assigned to a make-work job that reveals how language and economics of the future operate. And they're all very strange to him. He doesn't understand them, but he explains them to us. So I'm going to do an extensive quote from the novel now. So bear with me. Quote, "There were other words which I still do not use properly without stopping to think. Not taboo words necessarily, just ones that have changed meaning. Host, for example. Host used to mean the man who shook your coat and put it in the bedroom. It had nothing to do with the birth rate. But I got along. The job I found was crushing new ground limousines so they could be shipped back to Pittsburgh as scrap. Cadillacs, Chryslers, Eisenhowers, Lincolns, all sorts of great big new powerful turbo buggies without a kilometer on their clocks. Drive them between the jaws, then crunch, smash, crash, scrap iron for blast furnaces. It hurt me at first since I was riding the ways to work and didn't own so much as a grav jumper. I expressed my opinion of it and almost lost my job until the shift boss remembered that I was a sleeper and really didn't understand. It's a simple matter of economics, son. These are surplus cars the government has accepted as security against price support loans. They're 2 years old now, and they can never be sold, so the government junks them and sells them back to the steel industry. You can't run a blast furnace on just ore. You have to have scrap iron as well. You ought to know that even if you were a sleeper. Matter of fact, with high-grade ore so scarce, there's more and more demand for scrap. The steel industry needs these cars. But why build them in the first place if they can't be sold? It seems wasteful. It just seems wasteful. You want to throw people out of work? You want to run down the standard of living? Okay, well, why not ship them abroad? It seems to me they could get far more for them in the open market abroad than they're worth as scrap. Wait, and ruin the export market? Besides, if we start dumping cars abroad, we'll get everybody sore at us. Japan, France, Germany, Great Asia, everybody. What are you aiming to do? Start a war? He sighed and went on in a fatherly tone. you go down to the public library and draw out some books. You don't have any right to opinions on these things until you know something about them. So I shut up. I didn't tell him that I was spending all of my off time at the public library or the UCLA library. I had avoided admitting that I was or used to be an engineer. To claim that I was now an engineer would be too much like walking up to DuPont and saying, "Sirrah, I am an alchemist. Hast thou need of arts such as mine?" I raised the subject just once more because I noticed that very few of the price-supported cars were really ready to run. The workmanship was sloppy, and they often lacked essentials like instrument dials or air conditioners. But when one day I noticed from the way the teeth of the crusher came down on one that it lacked even a power plant, I spoke up about it. The shift boss just stared at me. "Great jump in Jupiter, son. Surely you don't expect them to put their best workmanship into cars that are just surplus. These cars had been price support loans against them before they even came off the assembly line." So that time I shut up and stayed shut. Better to stick to engineering. Economics is too esoteric for me. Unquote. This better future that Heinlein is describing is held together by robots our protagonist actually invented, and an economic system which seems insane to him. And that is the common theme in the stories we're exploring today. Utopia comes at a price, and what happens when that price is too high?
In The Door into Summer, our protagonist doesn't rebel against the system. Instead, he keeps his head down and goes about trying to figure out how to get back to his own time and change the course of his own life. Spoiler alert, he does. But one of Heinlein's contemporaries, Fred Pohl, spent a considerable fraction of his career writing economic science fiction. On our Politics and Media podcast, we've mentioned one of our favorite Pohl novels, The Space Merchants, several times. It answers the question, what happens if the advertising industry takes over the world? Again, spoiler alert, it destroys everything.
I think it might be worth an entire science fiction university just to talk about
it might be. It's a very good book.
Yes, it is.
And it's timeless. I mean, you realize, oh my gosh, advertisers and the impact of consumer culture on our lives is forever. Also, if you've never read it, go now and find a copy of The Day the Icicle Works Closed.
Yeah.
Which was written more than 60 years ago, and like a lot of Pohl's fiction, is today more timely than ever.
Yeah, we'll do a pair. We'll pair those two up because it's a short story.
Good.
We can do both.
Those are both really good.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a little teaser. It turned out that a small group of wealthy men could make far more money and wield far more power by controlling the media rather than running the most profitable manufacturing corporation in the galaxy. But Fred Pohl's story for today's episode is The Midas Plague, a vicious little piece of fiction about a future where robotics and cheap atomic energy has turned the whole idea of prosperity on its head. The world is run by the Ration Board, which enforces the use of ration stamps to make sure that everyone consumes their quota.
Absolutely must. You must.
And you got to remember that when Fred Pohl wrote this, everyone remembered ration stamps at that point and having used them.
You and I listen to old-timey radio all the time. I listen to more than you do. And there are a lot of commercials from World War II about red points and ration books and how Crisco can save you red points because it's cheaper and easier to use. And it really was just part of everyone's consciousness that you had a ration book for sugar, gasoline, meat, everything.
The red points were meat. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in this book, The Midas Plague, the lower class poor are required to constantly consume absurd amounts of food and leisure items and houses and so forth, while the upper class rich are free to live lives of simplicity. There is no longer anything called property crime, since using up material goods as fast as possible is the whole idea. The conflict comes when our low-status protagonist, Maury Fry, marries a woman from a high-status family who was raised in a home with only 5 rooms. Now she is being forced to live in her husband's 26-room mansion with his 9 cars and 5 robots because he is less privileged than she is.
Poor woman. Woman married so far below her status.
The resolution to the conflict comes, as it frequently did in early science fiction stories, when our engineer or scientist protagonist gets drunk and stumbles across the creative solution. I just want to insert here the idea of Real Simple Magazine and KonMari decluttering,
Absolutely,
and even veganism as a source of privilege is very germane to this argument. That what we're dealing with here, the ability to declutter, the ability to live simply under some ethos, is privilege.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And the idea of uncluttering your life, of getting rid of stuff, of not having so much stuff, would sound ludicrous to parents who just came out of the Depression.
Right.
And like, what? You have all this stuff? You've accumulated all these incredibly amazing luxury goods, and your priority is to get rid of them as fast as possible. That seems crazy. But, this is what science fiction is for. Now, another story from the golden age of science fiction that plays with very similar themes is Jack Williamson's 1947 science fiction novelette, With Folded Hands. And Williamson said that in the aftermath of World War II, a lot of these stories were from World War II or right after, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His concern was that, quote, some of the technological creations we had developed with the best of intentions might have disastrous consequences in the long run. No shit, unquote. I said the no shit part, but that's just me. Now, in this story, robots called mechanicals are basically non-sentient machines capable of performing very menial tasks. They're modestly expensive, and they're useful, and no one thinks twice about them until a competing brand of robot suddenly shows up out of nowhere. The competitors are not humans at all. They're small black robots who are far more advanced than anything anyone has ever seen before. They make it clear that they not only follow the prime directive, which is to serve and obey and guard men from harm, more importantly than that, they offer their services completely free of charge. No cost to you, the consumer. So the economics of the situation makes these new robots, which call themselves humanoids, unstoppable. They're everywhere. Soon they replace humans in all kinds of occupations, from cops to file clerks, and they drive all their robot competitors out of business. And that's when the bad thing happens. Because once they've taken over every aspect of human life, following their prime directive, nothing more than that, they prohibit any activity that might cause humans any harm at all. Suicide is outlawed. Humans who resist the prime directive are taken away and lobotomized so they can live happily under the direction of the humanoids. In the end, there is literally nothing left for human beings to do but sit quietly with folded hands doing absolutely nothing.
Now, half a century after With Folded Hands and the Midas Plague, we find the same ingredients, robots, humans, consumerism, mixed together in a different way in the Pixar film Wall-E. And I would argue that Wall-E owes all of these forebearers $5.
Oh, goodness, yes. Yeah. It's a wonderful movie, but yeah.
It is a good movie, but it's reliant on some of these anti-consumer, overabundant robot kind of stories. In Wall-E, the year is 2805, and the Earth has been abandoned by humanity after it has been reduced to a giant garbage heap by rampant consumerism and corporate greed. The human race now lives lives of pampered ease aboard giant starliners owned by a mega corporation called By and Large, while the cleanup of the Earth has been left to trash compacting robots. But the cleanup has failed, and the last remaining active robot, named Waste Allocation Load Lifter Earth Class, or Wall-E, has developed a personality. And that's where we leave the story of Wall-E, except to recommend that you do see it.
And I'd like to insert here as well that as we are recording this, President Joe Biden is walking a picket line with the UAW to improve wages of workers and eliminate some of that inequality that drives so much of these fiction, especially the fiction of people like Fred Pohl. So a little politics on the side for our science
very
fiction
timely,
universe.
very timely.
And finally, there's Ursula K. Le Guin's famous 1973 short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which a lot of you, I'm sure, have read. This was nominated for the Locus Award for Best Science Fiction in '74 and won the Hugo Award for Best Short Story in that year. Now, there's no spoilers here because if you haven't read it, you should read it. But it suffices to say Omelas is a utopian city, and our narrator takes us through its summer solstice festival in great detail. So we know exactly how wonderful and prosperous the city is. It sounds like a wonderful place to live. It's peaceful and it's prosperous, but the narrator also tells us towards the end that the city has a dark secret. And that secret is so terrible that every year, a few of the inhabitants of Omelas who discover what that secret is, choose to leave the city and never come back. Period.
And it's worth reading. If you haven't read it, it's
Really
worth
is.
reading. All right, let's move on to part 2 and talk about the original Dune trilogy and also the original Foundation trilogy. Both of these are on TV now. The Dune trilogy is streaming, the first movie of the Dune. And I don't know, is this movie going to be a trilogy or a two-parter? I can't remember.
I'm guessing it's a two-parter.
Mhm.
Let's be very clear. When we talk about the 2 Dune movies, the one that is done and finished, the one that's to come, those comprise the first novel in Dune.
Right.
Unless there's a
Right.
third one. So it's easy to confuse that with the Dune trilogy, which are the first 3 books of the Dune trilogy.
Right. And then Foundation is on Apple TV. And we're going to get into that as well. That's not as well received as the first Dune movie. And when I say the first Dune movie, we mean the Denis Villeneuve movie from the current time, not the earlier Dune production, which we're also going to get into. But let's talk about Dune and Foundation as they are on streaming right now. Both series have had more books added to them in terms of books. The Dune series of books now comes to 22 novels, including a Legends of Dune trilogy, a Caladan trilogy, a Great Schools of Dune trilogy, and a mess of short stories.
Mm-hmm.
The Foundation series of books has 2 prequels, 2 sequels, and a second Foundation trilogy of prequels that were written after Asimov's death by 3 authors and authorized by the Asimov estate. Now, we're going to stick with the original Dune book trilogy and the original Foundation book trilogy because both of these trilogies are considered to be canonical science fiction and among the greatest works ever written in the genre, and because they are both still beloved by fans 2 or 3 generations after they were written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you consider all the stuff that's been written, 40, 50, 60 years ago, and it's amazing. These 2 series are still just held up and reread and talked about and acclaimed by fans all these years later.
In everybody's top 10 list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why the failure of David Lynch's 1987 attempt to put Dune on film was still kind of a fresh wound around 30 years later when the subject came up again. The late Roger Ebert described it as, quote, an incomprehensible, ugly, unstructured, pointless excursion into the murkier realms of one of the most confusing screenplays of all time. So Roger never sugarcoated it, and he gave it both barrels. And this was the consensus opinion among most critics and viewers, that this was one of the biggest failures in cinematic history. And even David Lynch weighed in saying, I'm proud of everything except Dune.
The worst critics of all were the fans, who were heartbroken and furious that something we loved so much and that was so widely revered in the community had been botched so badly.
Yep.
The only thing comparable was the massive letdown of Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. But the failure of Dune was worse, because George Lucas began with a blank slate and it was his characters. He was free to take them anywhere he wanted to. David Lynch was adapting a classic 50-year-old novel which fans knew by heart. And so the idea that Dune was unfilmable became common wisdom, right?
Right. Everybody knows.
Until Denis Villeneuve came along.
Yeah. And then things changed. Now, on the other hand, consider the Foundation. The idea of turning the Foundation trilogy into a movie or prestige cable series didn't ever seem nearly as perilous. I looked forward to it. I thought, oh, cool. they're going to do the Foundation. This is going to be great. After all, Asimov himself had said that the premise for the series was based on the ideas in Edward Gibbon's History and the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he pitched it to his editor, John W. Campbell, as that, but with a galactic empire instead of a Roman empire. Unlike Dune, there were no internal monologues that needed to be externalized. There was no complex, centuries-old breeding programs that intertwined with politics. There were no Bene Gesserit witches or Gum Jabbar tests or a mind-controlling voice to explain. If you could think about it, it's all pretty straightforward. It's a space opera telling the story of a tiny foundation of encyclopedists, which is established at the far end of the galaxy under false pretenses, in just the right place, with just the right people, to influence events in just the right way, so as to cut the inevitable Dark Ages, the galactic Dark Ages, from 30,000 years down to 1,000.
The Foundation TV series had everything going for it. A story that had natural beats already worked into the plot. A big budget, $45 million of Apple's money for just the first season.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of goodwill from critics and fans. As you say, Driftglass, when we saw the ads for this, we're like, oh, good.
This is great. This is
will
so
be good.
cool.
Let's try it.
I was genuinely looking forward to it, because I think the golden age of science fiction and the new wave, which is sort of where Dune falls, is full of great stories that would make wonderful series, wonderful one-offs. You know, everything doesn't have to be 5 parts. I think that's why they chose the Foundation. It has a bunch of sequels you can tack onto it, but there's so much rich material there that's never been tapped. And even though fans get kind of testy when you mess around with too much with their favorite plot elements, we generally tend to be very tolerant for some reasonable trimming and merging if it means we get to see our stories come to life. No problem with that. If you got to do what you got to do, just do it right. For example, in the Dune movie, the one that's good, not the one that's crap, I was disappointed that all that foreshadowing of Liet Kynes as a mysterious and powerful political player at the Duke's banquet was dropped. It seems like that's a really important scene, but I get it. So dropped was the ritual of the wet towels and the role of a critical early character named the Shade-Out Mapes was reduced to almost nothing. But none of that ruined the movie for me. That's the point. I understand that some editing for time and budget happened with The Lord of the Rings as well, and with Harry Potter. But we fans can be pretty forgiving as long as the director is judicious and gets the big stuff right. This is also why we were out on the Foundation series.
Yep.
And a lot of people aren't, but we are, because despite great special effects and a good cast, they screwed up the most important thing of all, which is very simple. The whole premise of the Foundation trilogy is the future is unchangeable and unchanging, that it's predicted mathematically to come out in a certain way, and only by putting the Foundation at the opposite end of the galaxy in just the right place, at just the right time, with just the right people, can this massive Dark Ages, 30,000-year Dark Ages, be avoided. Everything that will come to pass has been predicted by irrefutable mathematics. And it's all going to happen because that's the only way it can happen. And the Foundation trilogy on television screwed this up. They completely negated it. They made Harry Seldon a guy with a backstory and a past and a woman, and he's a clone, but he's also a hologram, but he's also alive, but maybe he's murdered and has a homeworld. And you have these emperors who are clones of each other, which is mentioned in the book but has nothing to do with the plot. And all of this strikes at the problem of turning this into a TV series, which is you can't screw with it because everything happens as it's supposed to happen until the mule comes along. And the mule is the variable in the second novel that changes everything. The mule is a mutant who can tamper with people's emotions, who can make you love him just by willing it. And that's what changes the arc of history. And that leads to the third book. But by fundamentally misunderstanding that the whole point of the novel is that nothing the emperor does can change anything, by throwing in terrorist attacks and weird religions and so forth, all of which would be fine. Don't care. Throw it in, take it out. I don't give a damn. Lee Pace, fine actor. Give him all the airtime you want. But the core of the novel is that you can't tamper with history. It's all going to happen because it all must happen because it's been mathematically predicted by the psychohistorians, is what they screwed up almost from the first episode. And by the third episode, we're looking at each other going, oh shit, they really didn't get this. They don't understand what they have because they want something that lasts 9 years. So they want a whole big backstory and a whole big post story. And I understand the economics of that, but they got it wrong. They completely got it wrong, which
They made it into the Leap Pace clones himself Emperor show.
right. And I haven't watched the second season. I understand. I may have this wrong that they blowed up the Foundation planet of Trantor, but the people somehow survived in a bubble or something that Harry Seldon surrounded them with the thing, with the temple. And I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ. It reminded me from like the second episode on of what happened in the last seasons of Game of Thrones. Where there was no more novel to copy, so we're just going to start making stuff up. Except there was a novel to copy. There were 3 novels to copy. All you had to do was follow the plot and then make any enriching, beautiful, special effects driven changes to it you want to. Use all that good Tim Apple money to make it look pretty and make us go, wow, and make the fans happy. But what they created might please someone. It might be an adventure someone loves, but it ain't the fucking Foundation. And that really bothers me because that is a novel that deserves to have its day in the sun. And it didn't get it because they decided they wanted to make something else and call it the Foundation. Now,
And you know that there's something similar to that with Lost in Space, the new show Lost in Space,
Yes.
relatively new,
yes.
which is they had a whole bunch of special effects to add to the Swiss Family Robinson story, right? But they didn't lose the plot. They didn't lose the robot protecting the child,
Right.
and having a relationship with the child.
Mm-hmm.
They left Mr. Smith becomes Ms. Smith.
Right.
And actually, they did better, I think, with that character than the series did, the TV series did, because they kept the sinister part of Mr. Smith as part of the new show, and that meant more plot. That meant more struggle. That meant you have a bad guy, which helps the plot tremendously to have an antagonist. But Foundation didn't get it. They just didn't get it.
I'm convinced that TV people can learn, but sometimes they have to be hit on the head many, many, many times. So the third season of Picard was good.
Yeah.
Because it gave people what they actually wanted, which was the old cast having a new adventure. That's all they wanted. I want the team together, and I want them to have one more thing before Picard retires or dies. I don't care if Picard's a robot or a clone or whatever. I want the team together, and I want them to have cool things to do. And in Strange New Worlds.
Yeah, Star Trek Strange New Worlds.
Somebody figured out what Star Trek was about.
Yeah.
And they made a Star Trek
to take risks. They took real risks this season.
They sure did. They took risks they could never have taken in the 60s.
No,
ever in a million years. But they figured out what Star Trek was really about, what the elements of Star Trek were, and why it was essentially a hopeful, positive, dangerous, fun mission into the future. And they gave us that, and I was thrilled by that. And somebody else figured out with Andor that you don't have to have lightsabers and Skywalkers in every goddamn square foot of the movie, of the series.
And don't make a show that's about McDonald's toys.
No.
How many McDonald's toys can we cram onto the screen at once?
No, don't, please stop it. They figured out that in a fascist regime, which is what this is, there has to be an evil bureaucracy doing stuff. And there's a story to be had on a little planet far away that isn't frickin' Tatooine and isn't Alderaan, because apparently there's only 5 planets in the whole galaxy that matter. And it's stories that take place in the middle management of an ascendant fascist government with incredible weapons and power and spy networks could be really thrilling in that universe. And they did that. And that was wonderful. So the question is...
I want to talk just a little bit about Dune and ask you some questions about it.
Absolutely.
Because Dune is going to go on. They're going to have a second movie, which is the second half. Unless they make it 3 movies.
Right.
It's the second half of the first Dune book.
Right.
And then that's a hit, which we expect it to be. You know, we know how Hollywood works. I don't know if Denis Villeneuve will want to make any more Dune movies after he's done with this vision. My personal opinion, if he's smart, he stops.
Right.
However, if Hollywood may decide to make, oh no, we're going to make 13 more Dune movies.
Right.
And we've got 22 novels to pick from to make, what's the one after Dune?
Oh, there's
Children of Dune is third, right?
Right. The second one is Dune Messiah. Third one is Children of Dune. Then it's I think, Chapter House Dune, and then it all disappears in a sandstorm of novels.
Blur of Dune. Yeah. Okay. Right. So if you're going to make more movies and you say, okay, we're going to make more movies, we've got the rights to these, we're going to make, we're going to take the next two books, Children of Dune, and what's the other one?
Dune Messiah.
Dune Messiah, the second book, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune. We're going to make, out of those two, 4 more movies.
Sure.
Do we have the same kind of anxiety, given that no one's made these yet, about are these filmable? Are these, or has Denis Villeneuve proven, oh no, Dune can be filmed. Here's how you do it. And so go ahead. But are the fans going to be as connected to that as they are to these movies, to the first book?
The short answer is no. No. No one. Dune Messiah is a messy, unmemorable novel. Children of Dune is fine. It has a couple of good elements in it, etc. But no one is going to cape up for Dune Messiah. No one's going to die on the hill of, my God, I can't believe you left out that character.
You messed up the chapter in Dune Messiah that was my favorite.
My favorite thing in the whole thing. No one's going to. Well, okay, I lie. There's 12 guys out there from the con suites that I frequented in the 80s who are going to, who dress as sandworms at
right, and they're gonna be going page by page to make sure.
How could you forget?
In fact, they've already written a 3,000-page screenplay
here,
for Dune Messiah, right?
Check it out, man. This is the real backstory, and God love them. They're my people, and I love them.
Yes. They are your people.
Nobody is going to die on the hill, die on the dune of Dune Messiah.
Oh, man.
So I would suggest the most interesting part of that trilogy, other than the first novel, which is standalone genius and top 5 novel, science fiction novel of all time. The end of Dune Messiah, I remember Paul goes blind. Paul is blinded, physically blinded, can't see.
So he can't see Zendaya anymore?
There's a lot going on there. That's the least of his problem. No, the problem
that's the least of his problem.
That's the least of his problem.
Can't see Zendaya anymore.
Now that might not be a problem for the audience, but I won't tell you what happens to Chani's character because that would be spoiling it.
Okay.
I won't tell you what happens to the emperor's daughter because that would be spoiling it. But I will say that Princess Irulan, who's if you read the Dune novels, every chapter is headed by a paragraph from her book of the history of what's going on. So one of the parts of Dune
she's written this. This is her story. Right.
This is all a recounted story of what has gone before.
Just like I, Claudius, which we just finished watching, right? It's a recounted story.
You bring in the Ixians and you bring in the people who create, a taboo technology, and you bring in clones and you resuscitate people and bring them back as Gola. I think it's pronounced Gola, which are ghosts essentially, or cloned people with implanted memories that are like your loved ones. And there's a lot of, okay, fine. That's fine. But Paul becoming blinded at the end of the novel, but he can still see because his prophecy has become, his spice-based prophecy has become so accurate that he can see the future in detail. So he can walk through a crowd and not hit anyone because he sees everything perfectly. And his great horror is that the galactic jihad he's released on the galaxy is going to run out of control. He's got to find a way to bring it back under control, to bring the bloodshed to an end. And he spots what he thinks is the golden path forward. He thinks he figured out a way to tread this path very carefully to lead everyone out of the chaos that, frankly, he created. And so he sets himself on the mission of guiding what's left of his kingdom, because now he runs everything. Now he's the emperor. Now he's the man. And as a blind man, he follows the Fremen tradition of walking into the desert, presumably to be eaten by a worm and die. That's how Fremen, old men, blind men are killed. It's like setting someone off on an ice floe or in a that's where you go. And then in Children of Dune, which is all about his kids and what happened to them and which ones are good and which ones are bad and what blah 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 blah. Out of the desert comes a blind preacher.
Oh,
The preacher, who's a wizened, old, blind man who is hell-bent on overthrowing the Paul Muad'Dib empire and finds it corrupt. And what he's done to the Freemen is terrible. And we are all left to wonder, is that Paul? Did Paul walk into the desert and become this person? And now he's finishing his mission of destroying what he built, because what he built is a disaster, etc. If you take those elements, the screwed up, messy parts of Dune Messiah, and you take the parts of Children of Dune that are good, then do the thing I warned you against doing before. Chop them up. Use the elements you want, discard the elements you don't. Get someone who appreciates it and appreciates fiction, understands plot and character, to go through and find the critical path of the story between those two novels. And then take whatever elements you want to make that critical path
to tell that story. You still want to be telling the same story.
Yes, you do. Exactly. You want to get to the end where Children of Dune ends. And presumably that's like 12 years in the future, and your entire life is gone, and Denis Villeneuve is like doing like Peter Jackson, like, I wish I'd never made these movies. Now I can't see them. I can't see them with fresh eyes.
No, he can't watch them. He can't watch them because he remembers every detail about the problems he had making them, and he can't enjoy it. I get that. I
I think Mr. Villeneuve has proven his genius over and over again.
Yes.
His Arrival was his.
Yes. Oh, such a good movie. He
clearly knows what he's doing, and he clearly knows how to do science fiction. Yeah. And he clearly knows how to adapt a really difficult novel. So
and the thing about Arrival is it's so difficult because it's not time travel, it's time morphing. And he tells a story that does not have a linear timeline, and you understand it.
You're never
and
lost.
That's almost impossible.
And
it's good acting it's casting and good acting that makes that work. But the layering of the storytelling and putting the scenes the way you put them, that kind of direction I don't think it's easy. I think that's hard work.
Incredibly hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. And Arrival is perfect in that way.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how he did it.
Well, and the same thing with Dune, picking out what to film, from what angle, what to change.
Right.
Liet Kynes is no longer an old white man. He's a young African-American or Black woman. And the casting choices and the choice to make people wear still suits because Fremen do not let their face be uncovered in the desert. And the idea that there's these, in Lynch's version, there are these weirding modules which people hold as weapons and they power with their voice. No, don't do that. Don't do that. That's bad.
Well, but, they made a decision of taking out the ritual of the wet towels, which I thought was a very tense scene.
It was.
And very political scene, and I really liked that in the book. But they left the spit scene, the spitting on the table, and having to explain that wasn't an insult. That was a tremendous gift of the water from your body in a desert climate.
Right.
Thank you for giving us the water from your body and sacrificing that to honor us by spitting at us.
And also a test. Did you learn enough about my people to understand this is a sign of respect?
Right.
Or are you just a newcomer who doesn't know anything about anything?
Anything about me. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So there are elements in both of those follow-on novels that are wonderful. I think that if you've earned enough goodwill from the fans to continue, feel free to take out the scalpel, cut whatever you want out, put whatever you want in, preserve the core of the story, and
run it by Driftglass.
And run it by Driftglass.
In the con suite. Run it by the con suite. They're going to hate it.
2:30 in the morning, I'll be reading. I'll be passing pages around going, oh, no, this is crap. This is all crap.
You'll have your red pen with big X's through all of it.
or go on to make other great movies. Great, because
Yeah.
it's unfair in a way to put this burden on one person or his team.
Well, that's why you were saying about Peter Jackson. It's
Right.
like he had to keep going.
Right.
And why?
Stop, Peter Jackson. Don't make The Hobbit. For God's sakes, just don't do it. We don't need The Hobbit. We've got Lord of the Rings. It's a wonderful trilogy, and it stands on its own.
Yeah.
So if I were him, I would see if I can finish up Dune and maybe one more, and then figure out if I want to keep doing this or if I want to go out and make Rendezvous with Rama or something like that. Some amazing science fiction
some original
novel.
screenplay like you did with Arrival.
Yeah.
You know, there's no reason that you have to make all 22 Dune books.
No.
Denis Villeneuve, we promise you don't have to do it.
But the idea that there are a lot of good directors out there piling up on one guy, the job, because this used to be Ridley Scott's job.
Yes, right.
He was going to be the John Ford of science fiction. And he made some very good movies.
Yes.
But it's unfair to say, well, we got this one guy. And the future of science fiction movie making depends on this one guy.
The thing is, Drift Glass, Ridley Scott couldn't get over Blade Runner.
No.
He kept remaking it.
He kept remaking it over and over. Kept tweaking it over and over. I think you got it right now. No, you don't.
No.
And so I think, first of all, he's proven himself and we should trust him. Secondly, we need about 5 more such people, men and women, from all walks of life to make brilliant movies from the science fiction catalog that is largely untouched from the golden age of science fiction, a little before and a little after.
And while we are in this point in time, Drift Glass, let us express gratitude for an end to the writer's strike.
Yes. Oh, God, yes. That's wonderful.
Grateful for that. May UAW have equal success.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm never going to forget. No one is going to cape up for Dune Messiah.
No, they won't. Well, and let's be very clear. The writer's strike is over. We're grateful not just because we're greedy, and we want more stories.
We like new content. Thank you very much.
But you know what we believe in, Blue Gal? We believe in paying the damn writer.
Pay the damn writers.
That's
right.
Pay the damn writers. They're the ones. They start everything. Without the writers, there is nothing. So pay the damn writers.
Science Fiction University is a project of DGBG Productions. You can support the show by donating via Patreon or PayPal. Details at our website, sciencefictionuniversity.com. See you next time.
See you next time.